All of the cool sites operated by cool people have already done their coverage of Ilford's new Ortho Plus black and white film. So I'm already behind, but I've noticed that in some of the responses to that coverage, people maybe don't quite get the whole idea of what this ortho thing means or how it's significant to their photos. So I'm going to try to clear some of that up. Now, the first thing you need to know in order to understand what's special about ortho is that at the very beginning of photography, emulsions, we can't even say films because back then you were working with glass plates or polished pieces of metal, emulsions couldn't see any light except blue light. This had interesting implications for portraiture. There was great portraiture done in these eras of colorblind, blue-sensitive film, like this Julia Margaret Cameron portrait that's shown here. But because blue light doesn't penetrate the skin in the same way that our eyes are accustomed to seeing, the Victorian portraits always had a sort of a creepy Morticia Addams look. It was even worse for landscape photographers because to the emulsion, blue light and white light looked exactly the same. So if you were trying to photograph white clouds in a blue sky, the whole thing would come out dead white. If you underexposed enough to try to separate the clouds out just a little, everything else in the picture would be hugely underexposed. So trees, for example, would come out dead black. Here's a sketch of what the film was seeing on a representation of the spectrum. As you can see, the blue-sensitive films had some sensitivity to ultraviolet light, but the glass in the lens blocked out most of that. So mostly what you'd see were the tones that were blue and a little bit down into the blue-green. Fortunately, by the 1870s, a German photographer and chemist named Vogel discovered that mixing dyes into the emulsion expanded the emulsion's range of color sensitivity. They first succeeded in getting the sensitivity down into the green range, and these films were called orthochromatic. Ortho being a prefix that means correct. You hear it in the word orthodoxy, for example, beliefs that are generally accepted as being correct. Orthochromatic film came in at about the time that the motion picture industry was getting started, and filmmakers adopted the distinctive look of it as a sort of motif. If you see images of the early silent film stars such as Theda Bara, they have this very distinct look with very dark lips and very dark eyes and very chalky skin. Some of that was just an aesthetic, but some of it was also caused by the fact that ortho film saw blues and greens, but it didn't see reds. So if you put on nice red lipstick on your actress, it would come out black on film. Makeup artists such as Max Factor developed very elaborate makeup systems and charts and color systems and so forth so that studios could make up their stars so that they would look more or less normal, but still the orthochromatic look was pretty distinctive. Again, here's a graph showing about what this film was seeing. It would be, again, sensitive in blue, and it would stretch down a little bit into the greens and greenish yellows, but reds would not be visible at all. That means that red light basically didn't show up on the film. It was handy in the darkroom. You could use a bright red safe light to handle your film with no problems, but it still caused problems in photography. I saw a comment from someone commenting on one of the other reviews of this film saying, how about if you use a red filter to punch it up a little? Well, that wouldn't work at all. A red filter looks red because it only allows red light to go through, and that means that the only light you were getting is light that the film doesn't see at all. So it would just be like adding neutral density. Anyway, it was a problem, but fortunately, again, by the 30s, manufacturers learned to extend the range down into the reds, and films that had this property were called panchromatic for all colors. Again, this caused a different look to the look of period movies. You can see in this still photo that I picked up, the actress's lips are still very dark, but the gradation of her skin and the gradation of her lips and eyes is still a lot more natural looking and more like what we're accustomed to seeing today, thanks to panchromatic film. Incidentally, this actress happens to be Hedy Lamarr, who was also an engineering genius who was the first person to propose the system of frequency hopping that makes your cell phone work. Anyway, here's a graph of what you see roughly with panchromatic film. It does cover the whole spectrum. So what does this mean in terms of pictures you can take today? Well, frankly, I was not patient enough to track down a lot of different kinds of films, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate these different looks using Photoshop's channels feature. I'll turn on the appropriate channels and then I'll adjust the brightness to give a rough representation of a decent exposure. My friend Sophie needed some headshots and was patient enough to sit for this experiment. I deliberately picked a very neutral expression for Sophie so that you can see the skin tones in her face, and as you can also see, she's wearing a fairly conservative makeup treatment with a nice coral colored lipstick, nothing too dramatic. Now first we're going to turn on only the blue channel. And again, I've brightened up the image overall to compensate for the fact that we're only seeing one channel. And here you can begin to see that creepy Victorian portraiture look. Her skin looks very odd, sort of marbly. The tonal range isn't bad. The tones of the lips are fairly realistic, but the overall effect is dramatic but not very natural. Now we're going to turn on the blue and green channels, which gives us something more like orthochromatic films. And here you can start to see that silent film look with the very dark lips and the very dramatic eyes and the sort of luminous skin tone. I like the look. It's quite striking, but is it natural? You'd be hard-pressed to say that it is. Now here's all three channels turned on so that you get a panchromatic look, and you can see that Sophie's lips are now a more realistic hue, her skin has more gradation and depth, and overall it's still a pretty look, but it's more to what we're accustomed to seeing today. So where does Ilford Ortho Plus fit into this? Well, Sophie was kind enough to let me pick up my film camera and take a few shots with it. In the interim, she'd put her hair up, so you'll just have to disregard that. But here's what we get in a more or less comparable photo with the Ortho film. Of course, it's kind of grainy and fuzzy and blurry because it's a film image, whereas the others were digital images. Anyway, one thing that you'll notice is that it isn't really much like the 30s movie star Ortho look. I'm going to go through all of my filter combinations so you can compare. Here is the Ilford Ortho Plus film on the left and the color rendition on the right. Here's our blue only rendition. Here is our Ortho Blue Plus Green rendition. And you can see that they have some similarity, but with the Ilford film, Sophie's lips are quite a bit lighter, and her skin does have a little bit more warmth. And then here's the panchromatic version, in which you can see is more realistic gradation. The lips aren't as dark, still a little different from what you're seeing on the Ilford film. So I'd be inclined to say that the Ortho Plus film kind of fits in between traditional ortho and panchromatic film. I think that's why they call it Ortho Plus. It's mostly orthochromatic, but it does have some sensitivity extending down into the reds. Is that going to be useful for you? Well, it's not really full ortho. It gives results for people photography that are dramatic but not extreme. Nobody's going to think that you're deliberately imitating the look of 30s movie actresses. And it's good for people with smooth skin if you like dramatic skin tones. I'm not sure how well it would work on someone whose skin had red blotches in the complexion, because those red areas would turn out darker than your eye perceives them. But if someone has good skin, or if someone has done a careful professional makeup job, it does give a dramatic result. I kind of like it. I think I'll keep working with it, but it's something that's not going to work all the time or for everybody.